Welcome. My name is Garth A. Fowler, and I am the Associate Executive Director of the Office of Graduate and Postgraduate Education and Training. I am your host for the very first of the 2019 installment of How Did You Get That Job? The API's webinar series where we interview individuals with psychology degrees and learn what skills they use on a daily basis in their job, and then we hear more about how they got their current position. For those of you who are new to this series, our webinar is short and focused. It lasts 30 minutes. And in the beginning, our guest tells us briefly about her current job and what a day in the life is like and what skills, abilities, and competencies she uses. Then we switch. We learn more about how she got here, and then what would the path look like for someone like you interested in breaking into this type of career. During the webinar, you can submit a question by using the questions box located in the webinar control panel. As time permits at the very end, I'll select some of those questions and ask them of our guest. So let's get started. Our guest today is Dr. Karen Stamm, who is my colleague here at the American Psychological Association. Karen uses her training to collect, analyze, and disseminate data about the profession and discipline of psychology. Dr. Stamm's research helps the APA develop lots of wonderful resources and reports on work, the workforce, and career opportunities for people with degrees in psychology. So it's going to be very tempting, I know, for you to ask her about some type of field or part of psychology that you want to learn more about. But we're asking for today's interview to please keep your questions focused on her career pathway and her job doing workforce analysis. At the end of the webinar, we're going to show you some of the resources that you can use that come out of Karen's office to help you do your own career planning. So first off, I want to thank Karen to How Did You Get That Job and for her time and for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Garth. I'm pleased to be here today.
Excellent. Well, we're pleased to have you. So let's dive right in. Your official title is the Director of the Center for Workforce Studies. So what does that mean specifically? And I think more importantly, what is it you do on a day-to-day basis?
That's an excellent question, Garth. So I oversee a team of researchers who conduct research on the entire discipline of psychology. Sometimes we look at a specific portion of the psychology workforce, such as practitioners, scientists, educators, or applied psychologists, or those who are working in the public interest. But sometimes our research is more broad, and we look at degree holders in general in psychology or specific subfields, or we just recently completed an analysis on psychology job advertisements. And we were able to look at some of these specific groups, but also the discipline in the field as a whole. In some of our research projects, we conduct our own surveys. One of our major survey efforts actually is looking at psychology practitioners specifically to collect some of the data that we can't get from any other place because some of the data sources that we use in other regards have some limitations in terms of the precision and the lack of using the terms that we use in psychology. However, in many other projects, we use secondary analysis of some other existing source. For example, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is part of the National Science Foundation, collects a huge amount of information on the science and engineering workforce. They then produce public use data files that we as researchers in psychology can download and analyze and isolate the portions of those data sets that are relevant to psychology. So we get a lot of our bang for our buck in some of these existing data sources. On a daily basis, I'm doing many different things. I might be doing something like this where I'm talking to people about careers in psychology. I might be reviewing a survey instrument, providing feedback on some of our products, such as fact sheets, reports, or journal articles. Most days I'm poking around with our interactive data tools, which have huge volumes of information on the psychology workforce and education pipeline. They're mainly geared for people who are trying to find this information, but when we started launching these about a year ago, I found that I was using it to respond to outside requests, and they were really fun, and I enjoy poking around with those tools. I'm oftentimes representing CWS at internal and external meetings, and on most days I'm at least spending some of my time responding to requests for people who are looking for information about psychologists, typically around demographics, salaries, and specific workforce questions. For example, how many neuropsychologists are there in Fairfax, Virginia? That's an example of a very real question that came to us some time ago, which we unfortunately didn't have a great answer for that direct question, but we were able to find a rough estimate using some existing data sources.
So really, it's kind of staying on top of both the data your office collects, but also knowing a lot of what is already out there in a public format so that you can, and your team uses your knowledge of psychology and your statistical backgrounds and methodological knowledge to really try and help make great resources for people in the field of psychology.
Yeah, that's a good description. I like looking at numbers and telling people what they mean, which sounds like a joke, but it's actually a very accurate description of what I do. We conduct scientifically rigorous research on the psychology workforce and education pipeline, and then we use those numbers to tell compelling stories that ultimately help people inform their careers.
So for what you do, for the type of work that we just described, are there many other people who have, let's say, the same title, but might be doing it at another, discipline, society, or association? Or do we find that there are people who do this, but they have different titles and they do it in different places, some at colleges, some at universities, some in the federal agencies? What's kind of the landing for this type of career and job?
That's also a great question. So there's actually an informal network of association researchers in the Washington, D.C. area. Similar people hold similar positions and titles to what I do, where they're conducting research on their respective disciplines. Typically, the people in the leadership positions in those organizations hold an advanced degree in that discipline. So, for example, if you're in a history discipline, you might be working for a history-related professional association. But not always. Some of the research teams could have people who backgrounds in psychology if you have the statistical and the strong research methods background. There's also higher education organizations, and that association researchers network has a number of people from these kinds of groups. So, for example, the Council of Graduate Schools, there's some associations of colleges and universities. They also participate in those groups. Typically, these people have some kind of form of director in their title. They may have director of a specific name of a unit or an office. They might have director of research. And I actually do know of several people in these roles in other mainly health profession organizations who actually do have backgrounds in psychology. So it's a very versatile background and could be applied in those ways. In terms of the federal agencies, they're kind of a different beast. There are actually, I mentioned earlier, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, who conducts research on the science and engineering workforce. They do a number of other survey efforts. So they may or may not have psychologists on their staff, or they may not have people whose job title is psychologists, but they most certainly have statisticians and survey researchers, and someone with an appropriate qualification in those fields, if you had enough coursework and relevant experience, could qualify for those positions with a background in psychology.
Well, I think that leads really well to the next question, which is, we always here try and focus on not the job title, but what it is people do. And so what are the skills and abilities needed to succeed? What kind of, what would be necessary for someone to be successful in the type of job that you do on a daily basis?
So I'm fortunate in that the area of my degree is something I use every single day. My PhD and master's degree are in quantitative psychology. And these are critical skills to my job. I need to be able to make decisions about an appropriate sample frame or an appropriate method for collecting the data that we need for our research. Sometimes there are trade-offs. So for example, should we do a survey or should we use an existing data source? This was actually a question we considered a few years ago with our faculty salary data. We found that the response rates were falling, and we were concerned about the representativeness of the methods that we have been using on a historical basis. So we looked around for comparable data sources. We found one from the College and University Association for Professional Research, or CUPA-HR. They collect salary data for a variety of disciplines. And we were actually able to compare the same year of their salary survey and our salary survey and found that there were some slight differences, but they weren't deal breakers. And on the whole, the salary data were very similar. So we kind of looked at it from a resource perspective and said, well, we could collect ourselves, we've got these methodological concerns, or we could use this other data source where we don't have as much control over the actual underlying data. But it seems to suit our needs for what the information that we get requests for. And we actually switched over to Coop HR instead of doing the salary survey ourselves for psychology faculty, which then freed up some of our time and our staff to work on other types of research. I've managed to switch the course of my my research interests in several times throughout my career, going all the way back to my time as a graduate student. And I found that the thing that has remained a constant is my statistics and research method skills, that it's very easy to transfer those skills from one content area to another. So definitely my background in statistics and research methods is very important to my job at the moment. As I've moved up the progression from being more on the ground of actually doing the research to more of a leadership position, I found that communication skills are very important as well. I oftentimes go back to my undergraduate degree, which is in both psychology and English. I've always found that to be a very valuable combination. And it goes back to my joking statement of I look at numbers and I tell people what they mean. Both of those skills are very important. The scientific background I have from psychology is important, as well as the English background in writing in particular. As well as psychology, which also gives you some of the communication skills.
Well, so of those skills, you talked about, of course, your rich background in understanding research methodology, scientific method, statistics and quantification and communication. What are the skills that you sit back and go, yeah, I definitely was exposed to those and I started developing those as a graduate student or postdoc? So really, how can we help people who are in their current training to stay focused on these particular things because they are the transferable skill set that opens up these doors?
Yeah, I would say try to get as many research experiences and build your statistical toolbox so that you have as many methods at your disposal to address various research questions. One experience that was really helpful for me in my postdoc in particular was gaining experience in working with longitudinal data. I was working on a research study on health behavior change in older adults, and I hadn't really had much opportunity to work with a true longitudinal data set. It had, I think, about 8 different time points over a 10-year time span in 2 different studies. And while I don't necessarily use the content of that study all that much, I continue to use those skills. Be aware of newer emerging techniques and newer and emerging areas, and think about ways that you can use those to explore future research questions.
So when you sit here and then you talk about some of the competencies and skills that you use today, which were the ones that really came on board as you were in your job and as you were progressing through your career?
Great question. Well, what they don't teach you in graduate school is how to be a supervisor. And that's one of the skills that as you gain more experience, it's helpful to think, or it has been helpful for me to think about some of the mentorship experiences I've had and previous supervisors who have served as good role models. So using some of those experiences have been helpful. Also thinking about some of the teamwork experiences that I've had in the past. So it may be things like working closely with a teaching assistant, or working on an interdisciplinary team, or as a postdoc working with graduate students, as well as working with people from a variety of other disciplines. If I were doing it all over again, I think I would be going more in the direction of data science, of looking at how you could work with very large volumes of data, which are beyond the capability of what we've done in the past. I see that as sort of an emerging area, and it's one area that I'm trying to build within the Center of Workforce Studies so that we can take advantage of these very large volumes of information that are now available. For example, in that job ads analysis, instead of manually coding thousands of job advertisements, we were able to translate what we would have done by having someone read all of those job advertisements into a program and then run it on the text of the job ads. So I would certainly try to gain more skills in that realm. They also don't teach you very much about data preparation or data wrangling, and that's really important in research experiences. You have to fully understand your data before you start analyzing it. You have to understand where the holes are. You have to clean it up sometimes. Even in the case of an existing data source, you have to look carefully at the methods and the survey instruments and the distributions of how various variables fall, and then make some decisions about how to proceed based on all of that preparation and all that preparatory work.
So it sounds like things that definitely in our training we are exposed to, but it's really becoming much more practiced and much more competent at some of those things.
Yes,
Just handling it on you. Yeah. Well, that leads in, I think, to the next question, where it's like, how do you get that experience, right? And so tell us a little bit, and it does have to be brief. I remind people that our guests always create a bio in which they give more information, and I always tell our guests that too, that you don't have to give us your complete story, but give us a brief history of how you got to where you are now. So in particular, like what broke you into this field, and then what were like, a key turning point that led to your current position?
Right, so I've always liked math, and in graduate school I was very much focused on quantitative psychology. I had a variety of different research experiences where I've done, research in hospitals and that health behavior change. That was part of my postdoc. I've done some survey research on academic work environments, which is probably one of the experiences that's most closely related to my work at APA. And I've also done through my own personal research some experiments on gender stereotypes. So in all of those, again, like I said earlier, the content changed, but the stats background remained constant. Then prior to coming to APA, I had a postdoc in a different field, which was helpful in some ways, but made me realize that I wanted to go back into psychology. So when I initially came into APA, I'd applied for a lower position within the Center for Workforce Studies. So I've held 3 different positions: a research associate, a senior research officer, and the director of the Center for Workforce Studies. So I've kind of shifted from being in the weeds, doing the research, writing a lot of reports, actually handling the data, to gradually taking on greater responsibility in some of our projects where I was the lead person for one of our survey efforts, and then eventually taking over responsibility for the entire Center for Workforce Studies. And definitely my communication skills have become very important because I'm often representing CWS or sometimes even APA, and being able to explain the findings in appropriate level for certain audiences is very important. How do we get people to use our work? That's something that I'm always trying to address and trying to figure out.
Excellent. So let's go on to where we might find similar opportunities for people, looking to learn more or to break in. So I guess that's the first question. Where are the specific places one needs to go look to see what are the entry-level jobs, what kind of the descriptions? And I asked, like, are there specific journals that have the job advertisements? Are there specific conferences or professional associations that people should seek out to join?
Yeah, this particular area of workforce research is actually pretty specialized, and your best bet, unfortunately, is informal networking, through LinkedIn or various other social networks. I found talking to my graduate advisor very helpful because she was familiar with my educational background as well as my interests and the geographic area I was looking for a job. So she saw something that she thought was relevant, she would send it along to me. In terms of quantitative jobs, I've been a longtime member of APA's Division 5, which is quantitative and qualitative methods. They have a listserv, and I don't know whether they have a website or not, but certainly a listserv where there are some jobs that are posted. But I would recommend to people, cast your net as wide as you can. Be open to a variety of employers and a variety of settings, especially ones that you may not think of as first. Government and business certainly are settings that hire research people, including psychologists and people with perhaps a background in quantitative psychology, to actually conduct experiments or to conduct research or do surveys. And you could certainly apply your psychology background in a variety of ways. That's a consistent theme that I see coming through CWS's work. You can apply a background in psychology to a variety of situations and a variety of settings. As best as you can, set up automatic alerts through job boards and other services that are based on keywords, geographic location, or work settings or employers. You never know. Be open to those possibilities.
Sure. And so what type of, unique first-time jobs are there? Is it kind of like you said, you have to be unique and be looking around? Is it sounds like there's not really this typical, like, first you start off as this in the company, but you're really kind of always marketing what your skills are as a researcher, a methodologist, and someone who is, math and number savvy.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Focus on skills is important.
Yeah, and I do know, like you were talking about before, that where our field intersect, and I do career development, it's kind of similar, right? There wasn't always this unique pathway, but I know recently there's a lot more talk about getting people who have stronger quantitative skills, and so we can do, bigger analyses. And I think you mentioned before that data science and big data concept, like, when a number of people now come to a conference and they're using their phone to keep track of which sessions they're going to, we have all this data on how they made their decisions on what sessions were most important. And having someone who can parse through that is becoming more and more useful. So I do see unique opportunities to grow for people who are out there keeping their eyes on this.
Absolutely. I don't think it's much of a leap for someone with a background in quantitative psychology to get into those areas if you were interested.
Perfect. Well, we do have some questions running in, and we have some predetermined or pre-selected questions that we wanted to get to. But before we do that, I just want to know, is there any last-minute thoughts or advice that you wanted to provide our listeners? Anything to say, hey, if you really are interested, any advice on just their career?
Yeah, get as much practical experience as you can and focus on degrees as well as skills. What gets you through the door is meeting the minimum qualifications, but ultimately what gets you a job is, can you do the job that the employer wants? Do you have the right skill set?
So I guess when you say focus on degrees, you mean don't think it has to be a job that someone would traditionally say is a psychologist's job. Is that what you mean by say focus on degrees and skills? So as opposed to the title.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, so we have some really good questions here, and so one of the first that was a pre-submitted question, and I liked a lot. And this one was, what was the hardest decision for you to make in your job process, and what was the biggest role led in making your decision to do this?
It's a really good question. Probably relocating to the Washington, D.C. area. And I'm lucky that it grew on me, but I was based in a different area, and it was kind of hard to leave that area. And also applying for a job while I was based not in the DC area, because that was something that I felt I had to explain in my cover letter, at least in some broad stroke and general, a general statement that turns off some employers. Some don't care. If you're willing to relocate, it kind of doesn't matter. But for some employers, that's a red flag. And I was aware of that when I was applying for jobs.
So just knowing that you had to come here, does this seem to be the focus point, at least now, currently DC is kind of the place where a lot of these jobs are, or that was just your interest in moving to DC?
No, there were other circumstances as to why I was moving to DC. Yeah, so I basically was coming to DC anyway and was looking for a job. APA happened to be one of the places that I was looking for. Excellent.
So what do you enjoy most about your job, and what is the biggest challenge?
That's a great question too. I like the variety of what we do. We have no limit to the questions that we can answer or ask. On the same time, that presents some of the biggest challenges because we have a lot of people who come to us and ask us for things and sometimes want different things. So prioritizing is difficult to make sure that we're still meeting our mission of looking at the full scope of the discipline.
Excellent. So I was wondering, and we know from our own experience and our own training for everyone who's probably here that psychology does include, I think, a very rigorous set of methodology and statistics as part of their education and training, starting all the way back, I think, even in the undergraduate. But it gets more focused and unique as to what tools and methods you're using as you go through graduate school. So what happens to someone who might have found that they haven't directly worked with, say, raw data or statistics in a long time? What's necessary, or what's enough? What's necessary to get up to speed? And are there unique ways or efficient ways for getting back into being experienced with data?
That's good, and I'm wondering about that for myself too as I come farther and farther away from actually doing the data analysis. I always want to make sure my skills are fresh if I need to draw on them. Gaining practical experience, I think, is really important, of actually getting some hands-on experience of working with a data set. I mentioned earlier that the federal agencies have a number of public data sets. While these data sets they go through a series of data quality controls, and they de-identify some of the data fields, and they are very well documented. And a lot of the steps that you have to go through to start working with a data set that you're unfamiliar with are the same, whether it's a secondary data source or whether it's your own data. So, a lot of those data preparation processes that you have to go through, reading the methods, looking at the survey instruments, that's the same step as regardless of whether it's your own data or it's coming from some other place.
Do those places offer like courses on how to analyze and like use their data? They might say here's some that someone could sign up for that would just give them an exposure to being, to feeling comfortable about using those databases, or do you have to really be part of an organization first to get access to them?
They're all publicly available, although with the shutdown, the National Science Foundation's website is not functional at the moment. But they make all of that information available: the survey instrument, the basics of the methods, some of the key tables. So they are very well documented, and it's just more a matter of actually looking at it and making sure that you understand, what you have available so that you can use it. Census is another great example. There's a public data file. It comes from the American Community Survey, and while it has some trade-offs in terms of the precision, it is designed to be nationally representative, and it's one of the data sources we work with too.
I see. So one last question before we kind of roll up roll up our talk for the day. Someone asked specifically, do you have any IO psychologists trained in your background or on your team? Let me ask that question again. Do you have anyone on your team whose background comes from IO psychology? And I guess we could ask this question in a broader way. Is there any one aspect or one particular training perspective or subfield of psychology that you need, or that's kind of better for this type of work than the other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that people very often confuse workforce and workplace. So they actually very often get the type of work that we do confused with IO psychology. So to answer your question, at the moment, no, we do not have someone with a background in IO. As far as I know, we haven't had anyone, at least in the time that I've been at APA, who has that kind of background. But I would be open to it. It's one of the fields that, if you had the research skills, could be helpful to our team. I mean, at the moment, we have a team of 4, including me, at all levels from bachelor's through PhD, slightly different backgrounds. We all have an interest in psychology, but that's kind of where the similarities end.
Excellent. Yes. And I would have to say that I think that's just the same across a lot of these works. For example, there is someone on my team who has a PhD in IO psychology. But if you were to ask that individual, kind of what their companies are and skills on every day, it's really this management, understanding, career development. But their training and education helped give them those skills to get there. So. Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I would like to just close by first saying thanks, Karen, for being with us today. And I wanted to thank all our listeners for coming and being with us today. But, again, Karen, thanks for taking the time.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here today.
Excellent. So as I mentioned before, the APA offers many wonderful resources to help you move along with your career. And some of those resources we can take the time to highlight come from Karen's office, the Center for Workforce Studies. In particular, they produce this wonderful set of things called data tools, which help present information on the psychology, workforce, and education pipeline. You can use things like the Careers in Psychology data tool to generate tables and figures to answer questions about occupations and other employment characteristics for people that have psychology bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, disciplinary doctorate degrees, and disciplinary professional degree holders. If you're a regular listener to How Did You Get Your Job, you know that we always talk about APA's Individual Development Plan, or IDP for short. And this can help you map out your career pathway to your ideal job. The 5 interactive modules that the APA has designed guide you through the IDP process, which is self-assessment, career exploration, and goal setting, and they help you customize your own plan of action to help find the best job for you. In particular, I always tell people to look at the Explore Careers module, where we have videos on doing informational interviews. And that's because this webinar here today is an informational interview. And you can use this format to actually identify people who have jobs that you find interesting, arrange a personal interview, and be able to ask them the same types of questions that we did today. If you are ready to start your job search or want to explore job postings, then I encourage you to check out APA's online career center, Psych Careers. The address is www.psychcareers.com, and it's a place where you can create an account, upload your resume, employers can search you, there's resources and opportunities about finding more jobs. So we really say, if you're looking for a job, check out Psych Careers. Maybe you're looking for more career-related information, then you should check out APA's the APA website for members. The membership section of the APA features a wide variety of articles, books, and webinars to help you in finding your job and enhancing your own career development. As soon as the webinar is ended, you can take a short survey that will appear on your screen. We always encourage you to take those few minutes to give us feedback. It helps us know how we are doing, what we can improve. And as I've said, every year that we've done this, we've been able to integrate changes and improvements in our webinar based upon your feedback. So please take that opportunity. 2019 is going to be a big year for us. We're going to make some, like I said, some interesting changes based upon your feedback and what we've seen. So we'll be expanding our guest list in the future to include individuals that have bachelor's and master's degrees in psychology. For the first year and a half, we've only had interviewees with PhDs, but we think this will be a great expansion, and we'll find out how those individuals utilize their psychology training in a lot of different careers. And if you attended our virtual conference in October, you'll recall we held 2 workshops on resume writing and networking. These were very popular, and we're planning to do a lot more of those in the coming months, which you can see up there. And lastly, we are going to hold another virtual conference in the fall. You should keep your eye out for information in marketing and advertising on that, and we hope that you will sign up and find that to be very helpful. That's it for today. We want to thank you for attending How Did You Get That Job, and have a nice afternoon.